Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 15th edition of Exploring Enterprise, the podcast series from the Enterprise Research Centre. I'm Professor Stephen Roper, Director of the ERC, and today we're going to be reflecting on an important theme which has become a growing concern for SMEs all over the country. This is business crime and particularly business fraud. To discuss this theme, I'm delighted to be joined today by Amber Burridge, who's Head of Fraud Intelligence at Cifas, Alan Bryce, who's acting head of the Fraud Advisory Panel, and Kristina Grinkina, who is policy advisor with responsibility for business crime at the Federation of Small Businesses. So Amber, let's come to you first. You head up fraud intelligence at Cifas, a UK fraud sharing and prevention organisation. Can you tell us a bit more about Cifas and what it does to help small companies?
So we are an independent, not-for-profit membership organisation, and effectively we bring together a vast network of organisations and people across various sectors, so including banks, credit file providers, telecommunication companies, and also the public sector, to share data and intelligence to prevent fraud. Now, we help our members to share data on high-risk fraudulent conduct through the National Fraud Database, which is shared in real time and is available 24 hours a day. It holds records of both first-party fraud, such as false applications or where people have been misusing a product or a service, but it also helps protect victims of identity fraud and account takeover as well. Now, we also facilitate the sharing around the insider threat. So, for instance, where we're looking at high-risk fraudulent conduct committed by employees against their employer on the enhanced internal fraud database. By doing this, by sharing this data and this intelligence effectively, we help our members share, on average, £1.3 billion worth of fraud losses each year.
And so, Amber, what does the data tell us about the extent of fraud in the UK and how businesses are actually being affected by that?
So our latest figures from our National Fraud Database actually show that filings are up 17% compared to the previous year. And what we've definitely seen with the economic downturn is that actually cases of fraudulent activity are starting to return to pre-pandemic levels. So we saw a bit of a lull in 2020, but as businesses have started opening up, criminals have been really quick to target that and target some of the vulnerabilities in processes. The key issue that we've definitely seen is around identity fraud. So effectively, the impersonation of a genuine party or a false identity being created to open up a new account or a product. Now, in the first 9 months of 2022, identity fraud actually rose by 34%. Now, this poses a real challenge for businesses because criminals are looking to gain access to products and services. And so verification checks are really important to ensure that you are dealing with the genuine customer. And we know, unfortunately, in the past year, there has been such a rise in the likes of phishing and smishing attacks on consumers, often impersonating known brands as well to get them to divulge their personal and financial information. And what we've definitely seen as a knock-on effect there is actually the number of businesses that have also been compromised in this way. So we've actually seen a 38% rise in companies being impersonated to apply for the likes of telecoms products, loans, and asset finance products as well. So by utilising a company profile, criminals are able to access high-value goods. And it is really important to think about your digital footprint because if your brand is being spoofed, not only are consumers being targeted, but actually your brand from a reputation perspective is also being impacted in that respect. And I think the other thing I do want to touch on is around the insider threat for businesses. Particularly in the last couple of years, we have moved to more remote working. And what we have really seen is that the number of individuals recorded on our internal fraud database has actually risen by nearly a quarter in the first 9 months of 2022. And this is mainly in relation to the likes of dishonest actions, so stealing cash from the employer, in also kind of submitting false overtime submissions, also false expenses, but also applications have also increased. So the number of false applications made to businesses has risen as well by nearly 50%. And this is in relation to concealing information. So the one thing for smaller to medium enterprises need to really consider is actually doing those checks on those individuals that are applying for roles within your organisation, not just in terms of the individual themselves, but also the references that they're also providing to you.
So we'll come back, Amber, to some aspects of all of that range of threats that small businesses face a little bit later on, and some of the sort of corrective actions that businesses might be able to take. Kristina, I know that you at the FSB have also undertaken some research with your members around some of the impacts of business crime and perhaps fraud in particular. Tell us a little bit about some of the kind of key findings from that, would you?
Yeah, of course. The last piece of research that we undertook was actually in 2019. So this is looking at before the pandemic. And even then, incidences of phishing, incidences of processing fraudulent payments and online invoice fraud were rife. As small businesses and high proportions were reporting those issues. And at the same time, also a fifth of small businesses at the time had reported fraud to be the most disruptive crime for them, same as cybercrime on its own as well. But what has come through essentially is that businesses were reporting essentially both insider and outsider fraud as well. So essentially what the way that picture looks at the moment as well now is that, in fact, that hasn't changed much. There are still phishing is very much rife. The targeting may have. So, for example, if we look at the latest stats from Action Fraud as well, who have said that invoice fraud has been one of their sorts of biggest issues in the construction sector most recently. But in terms of actually individual sectors being targeted, it might be different types of fraud for sectors, but that is actually prevalent across every sector. So I don't think any sector in particular is getting targeted as well. So clearly, fraudsters don't discriminate according to sector. But as I mentioned, so our findings were before the pandemic, and these were Action Fraud findings now. And what we do know, what has happened over the pandemic is that a lot of businesses moved online. So we know that a lot of businesses that may have not been at risk of online fraud, although telephone fraud, more traditional types of fraud, they still would have been an issue, are now more at risk. So we're actually also now conducting a sort of follow-up piece of research to essentially compare the data as well.
Thanks, Kristina. We might come back to the idea about how business leaders are aware of this a bit later on. Alan, I want you to come to you. Both Kristina and Amber have talked about a range of ways in which businesses might actually experience threats, insider fraud, outsider fraud, impersonation. And I wondered how, in your experience, this actually affects businesses. Is this just a short-term turnover impact, or are there other ways in which this experience of crime actually influences impacts these companies?
Thanks, Stephen. Actually, it's quite interesting from an impact perspective, because I think you could almost, in our experience, separate this out between what would be traditionally viewed as the impact on the business itself. And then there's the other side of that, which I don't think you should ever forget, which is the impact on those employed by the business, the owner of the business, the management team. And both are really quite considerable. So if you look at the impact of the business, then most people would think, well, the financial impact. And clearly, and unfortunately, because of the nature of business, SMEs we're talking about here, small businesses, some frauds can be of significant value that they can effectively bring down a business. There's been very many documented cases around that. So there is the financial harm that probably most people would immediately recognize in terms of the fraud itself. I would actually just at that time also say, don't forget, if you're a business, the amount of time after a fraud has occurred that you have to take to address that fraud is significant. So it's not just the amount you lose in the fraud, the amount of time that would otherwise be spent on other business activities, much more obviously profitable to the business, can be quite considerable. I really wouldn't underestimate that, and we hear that time and time again. And then there's long-term financial impacts. Even if business is successful in terms of recovering from the fraud, they do have impacts like, for example, insurance being the insurance premiums can go up quite substantially. And then you have the issue reputational, in terms of the reputational damage that many businesses view there to be. Though I would put a little pause on that particular point, because I think I think most businesses and most people now realize that, sadly, if you haven't been hit by a fraud, you will be hit by a fraud. So I think the days, hopefully, of not talking about frauds when they occur, hopefully are going to be eventually past us. And that's quite important if we're to tackle the frauds. And then within the employees, I definitely don't, I wouldn't think that people should underestimate the impact it has on things like morale and trust within, especially small businesses, when you're working, and particularly if it's an insider, as we've just been hearing about the insider risk on the increase. The impact that can have in the whole working environment's really quite significant. But on the individual, we've done a great deal of work in the last year around a campaign on small business fraud. And one thing we hear time and time again, particularly from owners, is around the stress involved with dealing with the fraud, really quite significant health issues, and not excluding mental health issues. And in some cases, and sadly there is a case on our that we've been highlighting more recently around SME fraud, where in fact, actually, sadly, one of the owners of one of the businesses affected by a fraudster who had committed frauds against multiple SMEs, one of them actually went on to commit suicide. So these are really quite horrific impacts that can have on a personal level, as well as potentially even threatening the existence of the business itself.
And I suppose when you've got smaller businesses, many of which might be family businesses themselves, that sort of doubles the impact, because the business and the family will be very close. And so that can multiply this kind of effect, I guess.
Yes, I mean, that gets right back to that trust point I made. It's if you, in particular small businesses, there's a great deal of trust and obviously close working on a normal day-to-day circumstance. You add in the fact that many of these are family businesses, and suddenly that level of trust, and therefore really the level of personal harm that you feel when a family member, for example, or a really close friend long-term in that business effectively betrays the owner and betrays the business by committing frauds.
Thanks, Alan. So let's move a little bit to reflect on how the wider current situation is influencing the landscape here and firms' experience of crime generally, but also perhaps fraud. Amber, I know that you collect data on a sort of regular basis. So what have you seen over the last couple of years, going through the COVID pandemic and then coming to the cost of living crisis? How have these patterns changed? Has it all just got more intense?
I think it's really interesting, because when we think about the pandemic, effectively, it did shift a lot of business to more online channels. And actually, the risk that comes with that is obviously you're then at a heightened risk from a cyber perspective. So when we think about cybersecurity, it's really important not just about kind of shutting the front door to these criminals infecting your systems, but also what training you can give your staff to spot the signs that actually your organisation is being targeted. Now, we've done research with businesses, and effectively 71% said that their chief concern was about being cyber attacked. And yet less than half of them were concerned about their employees being targeted by fraudsters. Now, I think this is a really interesting parallel, because of the fact that we receive a lot of intelligence around organisations being targeted through the likes of business email compromise. So receiving an email from a senior manager or a chief exec saying you need to make a payment. And UK finance data actually shows that in the first half of 2022, £40.5 million was lost for businesses through authorised push payments. And so I think this is a really interesting concept here, because actually we might be strengthening our defences in terms of putting the software in place, but actually there is still that education piece that we need to do with staff around recognising the signs if something does get through. And I think we've definitely seen an increase in more of a dual-pronged approach now. So, for instance, we're seeing employees receive invoices And then to challenge that invoice, they're being told to call a number. Now, when they call that number, that isn't the supplier that they're talking to. This is actually a fake call center that they've been directed to. And ultimately, they're then being socially engineered to reveal some of that information. So I think there is a challenge there in terms of ensuring that, we do give regular training to staff, to employees around what that threat picture looks like, but also in terms of, if you have experienced this, sharing it with your colleagues, because actually the knowledge of sharing that attempt is really important so that other staff don't fall foul to the same technique.
I think it's a really important point because, we do talk to many small businesses. Many may invest in new technology and the cyber, the sort of like the online security and passwords. But actually, it's the people that very much operate these systems, and that can be a vulnerability in the way that you suggested, I think.
And we also see now that actually, as kind of businesses are opening up more, that criminals are now contacting the contact center and targeting them, socially engineering them to reveal information so they can gain access to products and accounts. So, for instance, regularly calling your contact center or even your organization, you don't need a contact center to be targeted, trying to work out what is the process to gain access to some of these accounts. And then, of course, the other alternative that we do definitely see from contacting the business itself is often then in terms of impersonating the bank or impersonating a police officer, saying, actually, we've recognised some fraudulent activity on your account. You need to move your funds into another account. It's not just the consumer that's targeted in that way. Businesses are also being targeted in that way. And I think particularly with remote working as well, where a number of us are kind of in this hybrid movement, actually receiving that phone call when you're working from home, it's really difficult to kind of just say, oh, hold on a moment, and ask someone who might be sat opposite you or someone that's in the room with you to verify that. So criminals are really exploiting that at the moment.
Kristina, how has this pattern changed for your members, do you think, during the cost of living crisis? Has that changed the story as well a little bit?
Yeah, so I absolutely echo what Amber has just said on every point about the importance of training and, of staff being able to spot these issues as well. How that's changed. So, for example, on the fraudulent claims, so essentially fraudsters always try to sort of target the vulnerabilities. So with the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, there's always been the issues of things like cash flow, so the government tax rebates, things like that. So these are the things that have essentially come through, and this is what we're seeing come through as well through our members, essentially. And I think Action Fraud also, as well as many other organizations, often put out warnings about the latest sort of the types of scams that are going out. And this is something that we try to essentially share with our members as well as a bit of knowledge to what to look out for. But the truth is the fraudsters they really do evolve as the risks evolve. And they do try to target those kind of vulnerabilities, and they will sort of essentially prey on the sort of weakest link in the chain to trying to get in. But yeah, like I said, in terms of the so for example, online shopping scams during the pandemic and HMRC's financial support, and then with cost of living, there's been the energy rebate scams as well that have been quite prevalent recently with the cost of energy being so high. I think so a lot of businesses as well as individuals could be at risk.
So, Alan, turning to you, can you say a word or two about what the work that you're doing through the Fraud Advisory Panel and its campaign to sort of try and help businesses to avoid being the victim of fraud?
Yeah, of course. So starting last May, we undertook a one-year campaign called Love Business, Hate Fraud. So Love Business, Hate Fraud. Our view was very much that other big businesses, other sectors, the wider public they may not feel it, but they do get a lot of support around the fraud agenda. SMEs do not, and this has been a long-standing view of the Fraud Advisory Panel, and we have always tried to work with SMEs and other small organizations who need perhaps greater assistance. So we launched a one-year campaign. It's all on Love Business, Hate Fraud. Do have a look at the website. The purpose of the campaign is to raise awareness about fraud and cybercrime for businesses, but especially focused on small businesses. There's a whole series of material on there. Absolutely everything is free. We've deliberately gone for short and focused campaign messaging. We have like a myth of the month, so challenging myths. There we do 4 phases or 4 quarters where we have specific themes. And interesting, the comments that both Kristina and Amber have said about where risks lie, and I think some of these will hopefully resonate with them. And they certainly have resonated with the small business community. So our first area of concern, the first area of focus was around, well, the traditional wording is procurement fraud, but I don't like that term. I find it, to be frankly, as a fraud expert, it's quite a boring term and could mean anything. So we call it buying goods and services safely. And our second was around insider fraud. We've just come to the end of cyber fraud, and we're finishing now with something called managing the risk of fraud, which brings together many of these different aspects and other areas which are important to SMEs if they want to be effective around tackling fraud. So, for example, for all of those quarters, you'll have a short 2-page guide about what the risks are in relation to SMEs, a quick checklist, a short 45-second top tips video, things you can do that's simple and practical, because we think those will make the biggest difference for effectively no cost. There's a webinar, and again, it's all available. It's freely available. Do go on there. We've had speakers from Cifas, from the Federation of Small Businesses, and many other organizations and individuals are really keen to bring to public prominence not just the risks we're talking about for small businesses, but the things that they can simply do. And within that, given your first question to me, we actually have a victim, a very brave individual who was willing to speak publicly about what happened to them and how it's impacted in terms of their business on a personal level. All of that is in the public domain, and we really encourage others to use that. In addition, we also have something called Business Fraud Watch. So this we bring together, we have got more than 70 organizations now. We meet every 6 weeks to share, I'll call it soft intelligence on fraud and cyber risks. But the difference is we don't just keep it within that organization. And again, the Federation of Small Business is a good example. We also have City of London Police, National Cybersecurity Centre, a whole series of different banks, financial institutions, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, England and Wales, among many organizations. But sharing soft intel about current and emerging threats. But we don't just leave it there. We actually publish it. We send it out. We give it out to any of our partners organizations, a short summary of what the current risks are. And I think Amber really made that point earlier about really sharing information. And Kristina pointed out other sources. We bring it together, hard data as well as soft data about what's happening. And actually, we encourage anybody and everybody who's involved who want to do something about supporting small businesses to put your logo on it and send it out, all completely free and freely available. And there's so much that can be done around that importance of awareness. And I think both Kristina and Amber hit on this point, and it's core to our approach. So absolutely, technology's changed to the cyber agenda. There's an increasing insider threat. And if you want to be incredibly brutal about it, staff are the greatest threat from a fraud perspective to small businesses. But they're also the greatest defense if you engage with them properly and raise that awareness and encourage them to understand where they might be targeted, and they might be targeted through them to get to the business. So there's a great, almost a fairly unused pool, I would say, of staff and SMEs who could be doing more if businesses work properly with their employees.
Amber, if I come to you for a moment, what do you think are the kind of key steps that a small business can take to try to reduce the risks here? We've talked already about awareness a little bit, potentially staff training. Are there other steps that small firms should be considering?
So I think there are some really simple steps actually that small businesses can take. So if we look at the insider threat first, I think just some general well-being checks with your staff to see how they're doing, particularly with the current economic situation. You can mitigate some of those insider threats by simply just having a cup of tea with your staff and just having a catch up with them to see what's going on. Because the thing that we've seen with more remote working is that actually if you've got staff who are struggling to make ends meet because of the rise in living costs, they're a little bit more isolated now because they are working from home. And so it's very easy actually to become quite disgruntled with your job. And so actually just doing some basic touch points with them around what's going on is really important to mitigate the likes of them being approached by criminals to give commercial data or personal data over. So some real simple things there you can do. But also I touched earlier around organisations having their brand being abused. And I think you can set up a simple Google alert to see actually where is your brand being mentioned. You don't need to go down fancy software routes. You can actually do some very simple searching yourself to see if your brand is being abused, and you can report it. So obviously Action Fraud have a great way to report, particularly if you believe that you are at risk of a cyber threat. You can report that very quickly on their website to them or call them. I think the other thing I would like to raise is, we've spoken about awareness and training. I can't emphasise this enough because it is really important for staff to be up to date with the latest techniques that are being used. If you have received an unsolicited phone call and you are concerned about it, tell other people that you work with or even other businesses that you work with, this is the type of phone call that I received today. Like Alan's touched on, there are so many ways of bringing that community together. By sharing that, you make it more hostile for criminals to target the business community in general. And I think one thing that is going to be of concern for businesses as we go into this economic downturn is around individuals who are looking to exploit vulnerabilities within your processes. So we have seen that from a recent survey that 1 in 12 actually would falsely claim a non-delivery of their goods and services. So if you are an organisation that effectively are kind of sending out goods and services, just ensure that you've got the right processes in place to be able to look at those claims that come through. And also don't be afraid to challenge as well, in terms of actually, if you've received something where you think, actually, this looks like a bit of a false statement here, actually don't be afraid to challenge that, because you need to protect your business as well.
Thanks, Amber. Kristina, I know the FSB has done work on this in the past, but I think you're working on some new research around this kind of area of crime and fraud. What's that actually going to cover, and will it address some of the sort of gaps in our evidence base around this kind of area?
Yeah, definitely. Well, we are working on some research at the moment. The survey is out at the moment. It's for members and non-members. So essentially, if anyone is listening to the podcast shortly after it publishes, it is available on our social media. But essentially, what it will cover is it looks at all crimes, so including cyber, fraud, and more traditional, the physical world of crimes. And it essentially aims to assess the impact on businesses, what protections they have in place, whether they report it, and if so, what is the outcome of these reports, and if not, if they don't report it, why don't they report it? So are there challenges, maybe in the systems, or I don't know, any other sorts of kind of reasons. I think insurance has been mentioned as well. And those kind of issues. It also looks at sort of the impacts of crime in terms of direct sort of financial, but also indirect. So loss of staff, reputational damage, those kind of things. And I think these will be sort of key issues to underline as well when we speak to our key stakeholders, including government, on those issues, and really try to sort of provide that data on the impact of fraud and other types of crime on small businesses.
Thanks, Kristina. And that's a nice sort of segue into the last topic I wanted to cover briefly today. We've talked quite a lot about what small businesses themselves can do to sort of prevent themselves being victims of fraud and crime around the training and the awareness and various other points. What more could we be doing on in policy terms? Is this more about, do we need to spend a little bit more time and energy around the awareness point, or are there other things that we should be thinking about? Maybe Kristina, I'll come to you first, and then we'll come to Alan and Amber. Just around this kind of policy space.
Yeah, definitely. Awareness key. FSB is very supportive of campaigns such as Cyber Aware and similar. Signposting to these kind of information, making language and language around the resources and guidance as simple as possible. Because with cyber issues in particular and fraud, sometimes the language can be very technical for a small business. So we always highlight about the sort of language being more sort of user-friendly. And then as well as having the sufficient resources of law enforcement to tackle those issues as well. I think that's also key, especially as the risk evolves and sort of develops as well.
And Alan, anything else from that sort of strikes you in the policy sort of space?
Yeah, I mean, policy is a very general term to describe what really I would argue has been limitations in terms of support for SMEs from government. We're lucky we have organizations like the FSB to stand up for small businesses. But certainly, I've been involved in this campaign for nearly a year now, speaking so much to small businesses. And when you see the amount of support that goes to other sectors, is that simply because they're shouting louder, if I can put it that way? And I know that's why the FSB's research is going to be so important. But let's be quite frank about this. The small SMEs are a huge part of our economy. Going forward, how much real support are they going to get? If you look back historically, I would say that no, they've probably had, compared with the amount of employment, the benefits they bring to the UK economy, they haven't had nothing like the level of support compared to the level of risk that they face. We have soon to have a new national fraud strategy and an economic crime plan, which will be published, we hope, soon. I would say reflect on what's in there. The Fraud Advisory Panel historically has never been slow to speak up about limitations around policies and strategies. And we will not be slow about this either. But if you want to get the SMEs the support they really, from a policy perspective, they require, the FSB research will be a good starting point. But I think there's more to come around how we need those who have a real interest in supporting SMEs to tackle fraud actually come together on a wider and more consistent basis. I think there's a huge amount there. And the big question that's lying at, and it's not just for SMEs, but that wider issue, and I think both Kristina and Amber have hit on it, is education. Now, businesses, that's why we put on our website, Love Business Hate Fraud. We've got, I think we've got 3 little animated videos, like what is fraud? Not what is fraud from a legal definition, but actually what it means to small business. Phishing videos, because those are current issues. There's lots of education that businesses can draw upon, and we'd encourage them to do so. But there's a much bigger issue here about how we educate people, the consumers and businesses more generally about the fraud risk. Everybody's missing the biggest point, if I may say, and I mean this in government terms. Fraud is the number one crime, according to the ONS in this country, by a mile. It's more than 40% of all crime. You add in cybercrime on top of that, you're pretty much at half of all crime. Now, that affects the individual, but that affects small business as well. And is the response and support that small businesses get sufficient for that? I would say definitely not. And just to finish on that bit of research, and FSB are obviously going to be providing more detailed research this year, and I'd encourage businesses to take part. But last year, as part of our launch of our campaign, we undertook, a similar piece of research, asking small businesses what is the most impactful or harmful crime that they face, similar in nature to FSB and other organizations have asked. Up to last year, so just after lockdown and COVID had effectively finished, up to last year, in none of the similar surveys of that nature had fraud ever been the number one most harmful crime. Last year's survey that we undertook, and all the research is on the Love Business Hate Fraud website, actually it was, for the very first time. And I think this is the first inklings that we're getting that this is now the big issue from a criminal perspective for small businesses. And it's about time government stood up and provided some policy solutions proportionate to the scale of the risk that businesses face now.
Amber, is that your perspective as well, that this is an increasing threat for small companies and therefore probably should have higher priority in terms of the sort of policy support for smaller companies?
I think one thing that tends to happen is we tend to try and do a one size fits all, and here's here's the silver bullet approach, and that effectively doesn't work. You know, we need to actually do some more typology scanning around actually understanding how fraud and financial crime impacts the likes of SMEs versus your corporates versus your sole traders as well. You know, it is going to be different for each of those organisations, and I think it's really interesting actually hearing the conversation, because I think we're still also looking at cyber being in one pot, fraud being in one pot, and financial crime being in one pot. And it's like, well, actually, they're all intertwined. But as kind of Kristina touched on, we need to translate that so that actually we understand what we're talking about when we're talking about what is the cyber threat versus the fraud threat versus the financial crime threat. I think for me, what will be really interesting is when we look at companies' house reforms, for instance, how that is going to pave the way for some real change to happen. Now, for instance, we know companies' house has been abused significantly by criminals. We know that. And so for me, it's about ensuring that we can really support our SMEs and our sole traders and our corporate organisations by ensuring that the data that is held is accurate, but also is protected from that abuse. So, you know, I'm not going to sit here and give you all the solutions on it, because obviously it's a very complex matter. But I think the first starting point of that is actually doing that real groundwork in terms of understanding these are the threats suffered by SMEs, and actually this is how we need to mitigate some of those risks.
It sounds like a call for a little bit more research, Amber. And as a researcher, that's always sort of music to my ears, as you would guess. I think we've kind of come to the end of time for today. Alan, Kristina, Amber, thank you very much for what's been a hugely important topic, I think, to cover, and a most interesting conversation, both on the practical level about what individual small companies can do around this to avoid becoming victim of some of these crimes, but also to support their employees, but also to talk to policymakers a little bit about some of the needs for developing the framework within which businesses operate. If you want to find out more about the business website that Alan mentioned, the Love Business Hate Fraud campaign, please visit lovebusiness-hatefraud.org.uk, and we'll put that web address on our webpage. Thank you very much for all of you listening to this podcast too. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more, there will be more of the Exploring Enterprise series. And of course, you can now find us on Spotify and wherever you get your normal podcasts. And if you're interested in finding out more about the work of the ERC itself, please visit our website at www.enterpriseresearch.ac.uk. Thank you very much to our contributors. Thank you very much to everyone listening. And we'll see you next time on Exploring Enterprise.